Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 7 today and complete our chapter as David continues his response to the word of Yahweh that came to him via the prophet Nathan. So just to situate where we are, as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been going since 5:6 through David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign through this whole series of acts. And I won't go through them all in detail, but if you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit of 2 Samuel 5 to 10, I strongly encourage you to do so. As we've been looking through chapter 7, I don't know about you if you've watched them all, but certainly my own understanding of this chapter has changed in the process of doing these videos. Because although I've been studying these passages for many decades now, I hadn't really noticed what I hope comes out in these videos of how little it is really about building a temple for Solomon, and really how little it is about Yahweh making a house for David. It's much more about what Yahweh has done in terms of the Egyptian Exodus story and linking that with David's reign and the monarchy, which we saw in Yahweh's word, and now we're going to see it again in David's word here, although the New RSV translation covers it over a little bit, but not completely. And the focus now is neither on a house for Yahweh or on the reign of David, but on the people of Israel. And part of what I'd like to suggest here is, although Israel, as you can see from the key words, is mentioned all over the place here, you can see Israel, your people, Israel in the dark blue here all over, as a people, not as a nation, and we'll look at that today, but no mention of Judah. And I'd like to suggest as part of the acts of royal consolidation, what's at issue is precisely his reign over Israel, which had been Saul's territory. He had reigned over Judah in Hebron for 6 years, but when he came at the beginning of this chapter to take the royal city that became the city of David from the Jebusites, that was his, although that's in what became Judah and the Judahite perspective that dominates the whole Deuteronomistic history, thus blaming Jeroboam, who rebels with the people of Israel against Solomon's son Rehoboam, for leaving Jerusalem and establishing worship for Yahweh outside of Jerusalem. But that's a later perspective. And as Halpern and others have noted, perhaps the idea of Judah as a nation, or certainly as a region, is something invented in this context by David himself. And although we see in the book of Genesis the sequence of 12 sons that come from Jacob's 4 wives that become the eponymous ancestors of the eventual 12 tribes, although not really, because a couple of those come from Joseph in Egypt, but that's for another series, that's for my Genesis series. The point simply being that in these books, in the books of Samuel, we've not really seen anything about the tribes of Israel. We've seen one reference to tribal leaders just generically in the previous scene, but no reference to the 12 tribes. So it doesn't have the Genesis sense of inheriting this ancient lineage of a family of 12 sons who became 12 tribes. Rather, as Halpern suggesting, that it seems that Israel is the issue that David is usurping from the house of Saul. And yet this whole sequence of events is making so clear to that few ever, both the ancient audience and modern scholars, have ever doubted Yahweh's giving David Yahweh's authority to reign over Israel, over the people of Israel, if not over the actual geographic place of Israel. So that's a lot of what's at issue here in our chapter. As we've been looking at the chiastic shape, David's response forms a very tight chiasm, and we looked at the A-B parts last time. We're looking at the C-B-A parts this time, all about raising up the greatness of Yahweh, which of course raises up the greatness of Israel, as we'll see in our immediate verses here in 23 and 24, but also raises up the reign of David, because the greater Yahweh is, that means the greater Yahweh's king is. And so the more one praises Yahweh, the more one is really praising David as well at the same time. So we'll leave up our key words, and one that's important in this section, which hasn't been so much before, is the Hebrew word debar as word. And I've translated it literally here, so it comes out a little awkwardly in things like, as for the word that you have worded here, which here, as for the word that you have spoken. But I wanted to highlight how the Hebrew word debar, which in Genesis is the means by which God creates the world, is so important here. We saw earlier about the word and heart before, Yahweh's word and heart right here, and we've seen the word, of course, before, but now it's really a key here that it's Yahweh's word that is confirming David's authority as king and that of his successors. So let's leave that up as we enter in our passage. So as we saw, just to we can see the entire sequence here, so I don't have to scroll up on the screen. we ended here. What we've heard with our ears, there's no God like you, and now it switches, who is like your people Israel. So let's look at that. As Rochelle Gilmore notes below, there's a concentration of Deuteronomistic language in verses 23 and 24. The tie between Deuteronomic covenant language and rest theology is reinforced by reference to the land in verse 23. Although it's translated earth here, it's ha'eretz, the ordinary word for land. And as we'll see below, as my note has, the NORSV is very strange, especially in this part, and we'll look at that more closely in just a minute. So let's look at this. Listen to this quote from Esslinger, who notes that Falkeman suggests in this section that David breaks forth in a paean to his Lord. But the second person address, referring to God constantly in your people and you, as we see here, may betray less a bursting heart than a calculated rhetoric to shade the relationship that occurred when the quote-unquote God ransomed a quote-unquote nation for a quote-unquote people. In the process, he becomes you, and a bond of obligation is congealed. Which to say, this is attempting to replicate what it's echoing, a covenant, not between necessarily the people of Israel and Yahweh, but between David and his successors in Yahweh. Even though this is all in the name of Israel here, we'll see that's at the center of the chiasm, but it's not at the end of it. So, who is like your people? Notice asking a similar question of who am I to receive all these promises that we saw just a few verses earlier. Like Israel. And as I was just noting, Judah will not be mentioned until 11:11, around the beginning of the Bathsheba-Uriah thing, but last at 5:5, precisely when it named that David had reigned as king over Judah from Hebron. So, notice the shift here, from nation to a people. So the nation is Goy, or Goyim in the plural, the ongoing name for the people who aren't Jewish in the modern world, translated through the Latin as Gentiles. But is there any other nation on the land or on the earth whose God here? And notice, as Falkeman notes, the God redeemed people recurred later in the verse in the opposite order. People redeem God here. Although, again, the translation covers some of that over, so we'll look more closely in a minute. To redeem it as a people. Liftot lov here, twice in the verse to redeem, although you can't see the twice here very easily because of the translation. But this is plainly Exodus language. We saw 3 times in Exodus 13:13 and 34:20, both of those about redeeming by offering a lamb or a sheep or an animal sacrifice. But this is the people as a whole. We only have seen it 2 other times in Samuel, once in 1 Samuel and once earlier in 2 Samuel, and we'll see it in 1 Kings. But notice it's not save, it's redeem. It's like buying back from something where there's a debt on it. As a people, as an so the nation becomes a people. And notice how foreign this is to the later Christian sense of individual redemption or salvation, that our relationship with God is primarily as individuals. That's a function of early Christian philosophy from the Greco-Roman philosophers who basically invented Christianity, as well as our inheritance later through the Enlightenment and the individualism of modern late capitalist culture. But in the biblical sense, it was about being redeemed as a people, not as individuals. The question was God's relationship with Israel as a people, and that's exactly what we see here. But it goes on to suggest that God's turning Israel from a nation into a people makes a name for himself through driving out other peoples. And that's where we have to look more closely. So let's look at each phrase by itself. To make a name for himself. Notice that that's echoing what we saw earlier about the Tower of Babel question and people, David's name being made great or Yahweh's name being made great. So making a name for himself, doing great and awesome things. The word for great is gadol, like we've been seeing all the way through, and we see it there. And then awesome, which is, and fearful, but I like the translation here as awesome. It also echoes as awesome in the NORSV when Jacob has his experience of the so-called ladder, Jacob's ladder, although in my Genesis series you note it's not a ladder at all. But he says how awesome God is. And I think that really captures it, even though it can be a trivial word in our sense, the sense of a fear that is also awe. So doing great and awesome things for them, notice distancing himself from it, as my note has, for the land in the face of your people, as most translations have. Driving, and this is what's completely messed up here. So NORSV has driving out before his people nations and their gods. here's the Hebrew below, and it literally means by redeeming his people from Egypt, its nation and their gods. The Septuagint has at the end nations and tents. And the Egyptians in 2 Samuel is only at 7:6 earlier, and that's plainly part of the shape of the overall chapter. We saw Yahweh's freedom since the Exodus, which is exactly why Yahweh does not need to be in a tent. We saw that named in Yahweh's beginning of his response, and we see it echoed here. And although there's not, as far as I've seen or other scholars have seen, a chiasm that ties the whole thing together, plainly by omitting Egypt from the translation, or the New RSV really throws off the translation. So I've gathered a few alternative translations from four different traditions: Evangelical, Catholic, and the New English, which is more ecumenical. And you can see in all four of these on the screen that Egypt is mentioned. They frame it a little differently, as you can see, and I won't read them all out loud. It's not to say one of these is right and another is wrong, but what's so important is to name both the recollection of Egypt, but also, this is apart from the translation, simply back to the theology of what's being named here, that God's name is being made great by driving out other peoples. And as I note for myself, and I will say here, this is a classic religion of empire expression, that God's name is made great by saving Israel at the expense of other peoples, rather than, as we see in Genesis, God's name is made great because all people are in the image and likeness of God, and all people can thrive under the reign of God. Certainly a message that Jesus takes up in the New Testament, to the chagrin of those who continue to want to see Israel as exceptional. Israel exceptionalism, like other nations' exceptionalism, to this day perhaps. But that's not what the text is about in the bigger thing. It's certainly the text of the Bible in that sense. This is the religion of empire perspective, that God is made great, and therefore Israel would be made great by destroying others. And to the extent that this represents Deuteronomistic theology, as Gilmore noted as I began this, we see that in its classic form in Deuteronomy 7, where God commands the people to drive out all those nations themselves, or I will reject you. I, Yahweh, will reject you. So you destroy them, or I will destroy you. Classic religion of empire, but not the way of Jesus. But it's important, I think, to understand the religion of empire text so we can understand how they continue to have power to this day, and how we can see how the Bible is this argument. Just like modern societies are an argument between the two radically opposing viewpoints, and many spots in between them. So after naming that Egyptian thing, now it continues on Israel, but then it will turn to the question of David, subtly linking the fate of David that's revealed here and his house with the ancestral fate of Israel under the liberation from Egypt. So Falkman notes that just a little ABA chiasm here. I won't go through that, but we've seen a number of simple echoes like that. So continuing, you established your people Israel for yourself to be your people, ad olam, as we've been seeing, which can mean forever or can simply mean for a long time in the indefinite future. And you, O Yahweh, became their God. This is all, of course, Exodus language here, as echoed in Deuteronomy in the voice of Moses. So we're seeing David sounding like Moses here, which is certainly the point of whoever the authors are of this section, inserting this into the larger story of what's traditionally by scholars been called the history of David's rise, and then following that, the succession narrative that transfers the reign from David to Solomon. So now it switches over to be talking about him. And as Falkman notes, David asked for nothing more than God sticking to his promise of a lasting dynasty. Esslinger below, noting something similar to what I was just saying, his deduction is that since Sinai was much the same as what God has just promised David, the promises to David can be added on as an amendment to the tail of the established venerable Sinaitic covenant. And that's part of Esslinger's argument that I was naming earlier in the chapter against a supposed dichotomy between the unconditional covenant to the house of David and the conditional covenant to Israel in the Exodus. And as Esslinger noted, and I noted in the earlier video, that's being taken in as David is taken in without actually looking more closely, as I've been trying to do here, and as Esslinger helps us to do, to see what he just said, that this is attempting to be added on to the Exodus covenant, not substituted for it. So let's look at that again more closely. So, and now, which begins a number of sentences, including 28 and verses, including 28 and 29, 14 times in 2 Samuel is the start of a sentence, and it usually expressing, as it does here, a shift in topic, and something that follows from what was just said. It could be also and therefore. So, and now, O Yahweh God, as for the word that you have spoken concerning your servant, speaking of himself in the third person, notice not as king, but as your servant, and concerning his house, confirm it forever, or raise it up into the indefinite future. And I really want to highlight that we can easily be taken in by this translation, forever, which leads to the sense that Jesus, as the New Testament in the Synoptic Gospels at least so often names, is a son of David via Joseph, descendant of David. But in its original context, this can mean confirm it for an indefinite future, not forever. Do as the word, as you have spoken. So again, highlighting the key word there is as you have spoken. So just scrolling down so we can see the rest of our passage here. Thus your name will be made great. No need for changing the language here. Will be made great. Again, forever. Notice the refrain-like element of this. Forever, forever, forever. Or at least ad olam, ad olam, ad olam there. In the saying. Or this is not the word, this is a little different word in Hebrew, lamor here, suggesting that this statement, not otherwise in the Bible, will become a proverb or maxim. And the new RSV has little inside quotes here, but the original has no quotes. So one has to ask, is the saying simply Yahweh of hosts is God over Israel, or is it the whole thing, which would exactly combine the Exodus and Sinai covenant with what we hear here? Yahweh of hosts is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established before you. So we can't know if the proverb ends here and that's just a follow-up, or it's all together. But either way, they're deeply connected here. And notice the emphasis on Yahweh of hosts. We had seen, and we see here, O Yahweh God, and we had seen, O Lord Yahweh, a number of times, quite a variety of ways to refer to God. But in the military context of David and what's going to be impending in chapter 8, which follows immediately after this, which are more attacks on the Philistines, it's the martial image of Yahweh as the God of hosts, the God of heavenly armies, Sabaoth in the Hebrew. So notice the equation in one verse here, Yahweh and God, Elohim. So there's simply no way that one can imagine different sources here, one of which is Yahwistic and one of which is Elohistic, since in the exact same phrase, and we see throughout, Elohim every time it has God here, and Yahweh every time it's in all caps. So here Yahweh Elohim, and here Yahweh is Sabaoth is Elohim over Israel, etc. So, underscoring the God of Israel. Then we have an interesting word, has made this revelation to your servant. Using the word gala, which is the Hebrew equivalent of apocalypsis, the Greek word from which we get the last book of the Christian Bible, book of Revelation, or apocalypse, meaning to lift the veil or to reveal something that's otherwise hidden. Which we saw here translated simply as uncovering, which is a fair translation both in Hebrew and from the Greek. So as revealed this or uncovered this to your servant, continuing to speak about himself in the third person, literally to the ear of, as 7:22, the verse before was in the ears of, saying, I will build you a house. But that's not what was said. The key verb, as we highlighted in 7:11, is I will make you a house. David was all about building, but Yahweh's not about building. Yahweh's about making. A point that Fackelman made, that Yahweh would not be invested into the image of I build, you build, but broke that by saying I make. Just as Genesis says, God making heaven and earth and everything in them. So David has not quite heard it right, and the text reveals that. So not Yahweh didn't say I will build, but I will make, but David records it here as I will build you a house. Therefore your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. And we have to ask, how does that follow? How does the revelation that David's house will be made or built by Yahweh give him courage to pray the prayer that he's already been saying all this time, that started with what can I say to you, as we heard here, what more can David say to you? So he's been saying a lot, as Esslinger notes below. By the time God hears him, we read how it was that David took courage in a chiastic section he lays out that I didn't hear. Some 7 verses of supposed speechlessness have elapsed. Have the courage to pray this prayer, and for the first time we're hearing it officially known as a prayer, tefillah, First here in the biblical order, in the sense of from Genesis through, but 7 times in Solomon's prayer there. And we'll see a number of things when we get to 1 Kings that are highlighting that in many ways David is to Solomon as Saul was to David, in the sense of becoming more magnificent and more formal and seemingly more publicly powerful through these first 3 generations of the monarchy. Then we'll see it in 9:3 in 1 Kings, and then 77 times in the Masoretic text. Not surprisingly, many in the Psalms, which are clearly oral prayers and songs all the way through. So just to go down to finish our chapter here, and so pray this prayer. And so now, O Lord Yahweh, notice it's switching back to that, you are God, in case we weren't sure, and your words are true, matching the chiasm of this Torah for the people. Your words are true on the other side, and you have spoken this good thing to your servant. Notice how the refrain here has just repeated over and over. God's word, Yahweh is God, you've done a good thing, you are great, so that we don't tend to sort it out as I'm trying to do here, but just have it wash over us as this paean of praise to a God who's done such great things for David and for Israel. Now, therefore, may it please you, or literally in the hiphil, to be pleased, but notice in a slightly different form in the niphil, it can mean to act foolishly. So there's an implicit, perhaps, wordplay there that it certainly is right to translate it, may it please you, but it also could be heard subtly as may it be foolish to you to do this. So we can hear it either way, although please is certainly the primary meaning here. Please you to bless the house of your servant. Barak twice in the verse, and we see it down here, as well as the noun form. So the verb form twice, and the noun form as the refrain at the end here, as we see down here. As if it wasn't already blessed, as if the word given isn't already the blessing. Blessing, as we've been seeing throughout the Hebrew Bible, contrary to what many Christians misunderstand it as, it simply means fertility. Fertility of the earth, fertility of the womb, fertility of the people. So the thriving of people. So in this case, it's not literally about children, but suggesting the thriving of his house, so that it may continue, if not forever, for a long time before you. For you, O Lord Yahweh, have spoken, and with your blessing shall the house of your servant be blessed forever. And notice there's no response whatsoever. Now we have this huge break sometime after. And that really tells us something about these chapters. And it's why many scholars separate out after the end of chapter 7 and have a new unit in chapter 8, because certainly we see a solid shift there. But I've kept this all together because I think all of these express this moving toward the legitimacy of his royal reign. And right after that is when it shifts into the Uriah-Bathsheba business, and the downhill slope begins that will continue into Absalom's rebellion. So we see this whole sequence of positive, at least within their perspective, aspects of what David is doing to receive this blessing and to establish himself as king over Israel as well as over Judah. And we'll continue with next time as David moves into creating a glowing and growing reputation, winning a name for himself at Yahweh's hand. See you for that next time. Bye.